Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled Queering Italo-Québécois Literature. I'm Patrick Donovan, Research Associate and Advisor at the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network at Concordia University, and I'll be giving a few remarks today before passing you over to our speaker and moderator. And before continuing, I'd like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. Concordia recognizes the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the custodian of these lands and waters. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. And QUESCREN also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. We're happy to have our speaker, Licia Canton, here today, who will be presenting her QUESCREN working paper, Queering Italo-Québécois Literature, which will be released officially in the coming months. It's also my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dominique Beneventi, Professor of English Literature at the Université de Sherbrooke. As a reminder, the format of this event will entail a presentation by Licia, followed by a Q&A period. And please write any questions you may have in the chat, and these will be addressed in the question period. We will be prioritizing questions in the chat. I will now leave the microphone to Dominique and Licia.
Thank you, Patrick. So I'll introduce Licia. So Licia Canton earned a PhD with a thesis in Italian-Canadian literature at the Université de Montréal and an MA at McGill University. She is co-founder and editor-in-chief of Accenti, the Canadian magazine with an Italian accent. She's the author of The Pink House and Other Stories, 2018, and Almond Wine and Fertility, 2008. As co-editor, she has published 11 volumes on Italian-Canadian literature, including the groundbreaking Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian-Canadian writing, 2021. She is the director of the documentary Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian-Canadian, 2021, partially funded by the Équipe de Recherche en Études Queer au Québec and the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers. Dr. Canton was visiting professor and writer-in-residence at the University of Calabria in 2019. She was honorary fellow in translation at the University of Hull in the UK from 2018 to 2021. As past Goggio Fellow in Italian-Canadian Studies, she has collaborated on projects with the Frank Jacobucci Center at the University of Toronto, where she is co-director of the Queer Italian-Canadian Artists Project. Licia Canton was president of the Association of Italian-Canadian Writers from 2010 to 2014 and from 2021 to 2022. In recognition of her work in culture, Dr. Canton received the Italy in the World Prize in 2018. So I'll pass the microphone on to Licia.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you, Dominic Beneventi, for the introduction and for moderating, and generally speaking, for your support with this project. I'm grateful to QUESCREN and especially to Patrick Donovan and Lorraine O'Donnell for their detailed feedback on the longer version of the paper. Thanks also to Anna Hunt and Lena Shumarova for their assistance. So the title of this presentation is Queering Italo-Québécois Literature. So I'll be speaking about the struggle for recognition, introducing some works in English by queer Italo-Québécois writers, and concluding with a section titled Queerness, Italian Heritage, and Ongoing Challenges. In 2018, Monica Meneghetti published I'm Queer and Italian-Canadian. Coming out was twice as hard. That was in the Globe and Mail. That is the seed that set my research in motion. The year before, Vancouver-based Meneghetti came to Montreal to read from What the Mouth Wants, published in 2017, a memoir about food and her queer lived experience. She chose to read only about food because she was fearful of the Italian audience's reaction. There are approximately 316,000 residents of Italian heritage in Quebec. Italian is the 5th most spoken language in Montreal. A growing number of Italo-Québécois identify as members of the LGBTQ+ community. They are openly queer outside the family circle and beyond the Italian community. Traditionally, the queer experience is not discussed or even acknowledged in Italian immigrant households. There is still some reticence in the Italian community in both private and public spaces. Italian immigrants, they weren't gay, Steve Galluccio states in the documentary Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian Canadian. The traditional values of the Italian community in Quebec have often led to the marginalization of its members who identify as queer. It's kind of a trauma, says Domenico Beneventi in Creative Spaces. Still today, in some cases, those who identify as LGBTQ+ are shunned by their own family. Next slide, please. This paper introduces established and emerging literary artists Steve Galluccio, Christopher DiRaddo, Liana Cusmano, also known as By Curious George, also known as My Firstborn Child, VDG, also known as Vanessa Di Gregorio, Anthony Portulese, and Giulia Gerbasi. These writers are the children or grandchildren of Italian immigrants to Quebec. The beginning of Italian Canadian literature is often cited as the late 1970s with the publication of Roman Candles, an anthology of poems by 17 Italo-Canadian poets published in 1978, edited by Pier Giorgio Di Cico. In 1983, Fulvio Caccia and Antonio D'Alfonso edited the volume Quête, Textes d'auteurs Italo-Québécois, which included the work of 18 writers. Over the last 4 decades of literary production by Italians in Quebec, scholarship has been dedicated to this corpus, including master's and PhD theses. However, only a few scholars, such as Michela Baldo, Domenico Beneventi, Paolo Frasca, have published on queer Italian Canadian literature. But there has not been any specific focus on queer Italo-Québécois literature in English until recently. Next slide, please. This began to change with the Queer Italian-Canadian Project, and specifically with the release of Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian-Canadian 2021, a 28-minute documentary in which 3 Montreal English language writers, Galluccio, DiRaddo, and Cusmano, discussed their lives and their work. In 2022, the film was presented at Montreal's International Film Festival, Image Nation, Culture Queer. Next slide, please. Because the research leading to documentary Creative Spaces sparked much interest across the country, we produced an anthology titled Here and Now, one that shows the rich and complex experiences of queer Italian Canadians. Next slide, please. By introducing a growing literary corpus, we look at the meaning of the term queer in the post-migratory community of Italo-Québécois writers who use English as their primary language. We are examining the concept of queer within a diasporic framework and illustrating what that looks like in Quebec and the Italo-Québécois literary scene. Next slide, please. As literary critic Michela Baldo writes, quote, within cultural theory, the concepts of queer and diaspora have been informed by postmodern and post-colonial theory and have intervened on theories of time, space, and identity, infusing them with notions of transgression, contingency, power, and conflict, end quote. Baldo's study on queer Italian North American women writers is pertinent to our discussion of queer Italo-Québécois writers. Similarly, the documentary Creative Spaces presents interviews with Italo-Québécois writers that focus on temporality, spatiality, and affect. Domenico Beneventi, literary critic and queer studies scholar, provides a theoretical framework for these interviews and discusses the notions of transgression, intergenerational conflict, and creativity. In his introduction to the anthology Here and Now, Beneventi notes that, quote, the invisibility of queer writers of Italian origin may be explained by the lingering taboos around the subject matter. He makes the point that demographics and patterns of migration are also a factor. Neither the first generation of Italian immigrants nor the transitional generation would be writing about these kinds of subjects. It is their children and their grandchildren, born and raised in Canada, who are writing their queer stories, and we start to see an identifiable body of queer writing emerge in the early 2000s, end quote. The term queer, Beneventi writes, quote, has increasingly become recognizable as shorthand for a very diverse collection of communities and sexual and gender identities, end quote. Whereas openly identifying as a member of the LGBTQ plus community can be accepted in Quebecois society, it is not quite so within the Italian immigrant community. To echo Meneghetti's experience, it is important to point out that the contribution of LGBTQ plus individuals was absent at the exhibit Italian Montreal, held at the Pointe-à-Calière Museum from 2021 to 2022. The objective of the exhibit was to showcase, quote, the community's important contribution to economic, social, and cultural life in Montreal, end quote. Although the exhibit included filmmakers and playwrights, as well as movie clips, Steve Galluccio and his work were left out. This is an example of the Italian community contributing to the erasure of LGBTQ plus realities, which Beneventi talks about in the documentary Creative Spaces. Next slide, please. Thank you. In direct response to the Pointe-à-Calière exhibit submission, the event Queer and Italian Montreal was held on July 21st, 2022. Hosted by Christopher DiRaddo, it featured Steve Galluccio, VDG, and Gaspare Borsellino, once president of the Gruppo Italiano Gay e Lesbico di Montreal, or GIGL, GIGO. In June 2022, Borsellino donated GIGL's 10 years worth of documents to the Archives Gays du Québec. As Borsellino mentioned, GIGL was born because gays and lesbians born into the Italian community in Montreal sought like-minded people to socialize with, people they could identify with. Next slide, please. Works in English by queer Italo-Québécois writers. The literary production of Italo-Québécois artists is quite varied. Steve Galluccio, Christopher DiRaddo, Liana Cusmano, VDG, Anthony Portolese, and Julia Gerbasi represent different generations, ranging in age from 20s to 60s. All of them have presented their work in public spaces, either in person or virtually. Next slide, please. Steve Galluccio, playwright and screenwriter, was born in Montreal in 1960. His parents both immigrated from the small town of Galluccio in the province of Caserta. He was raised in Little Italy. He graduated from Concordia University with a bachelor's degree in translation. As Galluccio states in his personal essay, You're Never Gonna Make It, which was published in the anthology Here and Now, he never really worked as a professional translator except for translating his own work. He later took creative writing workshops at Concordia, where one of his theater professors said that Steve was, quote, born to write. Steve Galluccio has written about his Italian immigrant roots and about being gay. His work includes the Gemini Award-winning TV series Ciao Bella from 2004 to 2005, Surviving My Mother 2007, In Piazza San Domenico 2009, Funky Town 2011, Montréal à la Galluccio 2012, The St. Leonard Chronicles 2013, and Little Italy 2018. He is perhaps best known for the play Mambo Italiano, produced in 2002, which is still produced all over the world. Galluccio's works are, in his own words, distinctly about Italian immigrant culture. Scholar Michael Hines describes Steve Galluccio as, quote, an Anglophone playwright of Italian extraction who cast a critical look at Quebec as an immigrant nation through the filter of Italo-Québécois attitudes to homosexuality, end quote. Galluccio came out through his play, and I quote, when my play Mambo Italiano first came out, I had a really hard time talking about being gay. Everyone knew I was gay because of the play. I couldn't deny it. I was used to not talking about being gay, end quote. The play was adapted into the movie Mambo Italiano and released in 2003. It was sold in more than 53 countries and brought Galluccio international recognition. Next slide, please. Christopher DiRaddo was born in La Salle, Quebec in 1974 of a Montreal-born father of Italian descent and a mother of Irish descent. His paternal grandfather emigrated from Italy to Montreal in 1927, then brought his wife over. Both came from the province of Caserta. DiRaddo has been active on the Montreal literary scene for about 2 decades. He is the founder and host of the Violet Hour reading series and book club. He also organizes LGBTQ+ literary events in collaboration with Fierté Montréal and the Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival. In a recent article, he describes his journey as a young gay Montrealer and his connection to Fierté Montréal. DiRaddo has published short stories, nonfiction, and interviews. He is the author of 2 novels, The Geography of Pluto, 2014, and The Family Way, 2021. The first is about Will, a 28-year-old who comes out to his mother while getting over a love affair. Through Will, the author presents the city of Montreal and in particular, life in the gay village. In the documentary Creative Spaces, DiRaddo states that he's a kid of the village. That's where he understood that he could make a life for himself, that he could aspire to become more than a priest. He wanted to become, quote, a professional homosexual. Through his character's experiences in the village, DiRaddo counters Will's mother's assessment that being gay is, quote, a very lonely life. The novelist creates a character who has a full social and romantic life. DiRaddo's second novel, The Family Way, goes further by chronicling the experience of a gay man who donates sperm to lesbian friends so that they may conceive a child. In an interview with journalist Matthew Hayes, DiRaddo says, "I realized I had an opportunity here to comment on what it means to be a family." Next slide, please. Liana Cusmano, they, them, also known as Luca and by Curious George, was born in Montreal in 1995. Cusmano's father was born in Montreal of Calabrian parents. I, Cusmano's mother, arrived in Montreal as a child from the Veneto region. Cusmano is a novelist, a poet, spoken word artist, and filmmaker. Cusmano was the 2018 and 2019 Montreal Slam champion. They have performed at Montreal's Pride and in the I See You tour. Cusmano wrote and directed the film Matters of Great Unimportance, 2019, based on their short story by the same title published in 2016. They also wrote the film script for La Femme Finale, screened at the Cannes Film Festival in 2015. Cusmano created Peuple, Poésie, Politique in the television documentary series Vivre Ensemble in 2021. Cusmano's debut novel, Catch and Release, published in 2022, is about coming of age and coming out. The narrator looks back on her childhood and adolescence as she comes to terms with her sexual orientation. As Kayla Johnson comments, quote, "The non-linear timeline moving between the past and the present unfolds the complexity of Luca's relationship to her queerness." Cusmano's writing deals with their Italian origins and the constant battle to assert their identity, a motivator for creative expression. Several spoken word performances and published texts address loved ones who work against the queer narrator. As Michela Baldo points out in Cusmano's A Poem About My Grandmother, 2020, the elderly woman's constant misgendering of the grandchild is an, quote, unintentional and devastating form of erasure. Cusmano writes, quote, "My grandmother doesn't understand why I can't just do things the way she did, the way my mother did, the way her mother did, as if we were all objects on an assembly line instead of items crafted by hand." Next slide, please. VDG, originally known as Vanessa Di Gregorio, they, them, was born in Montreal in 1993. VDG was raised in Saint-Léonard. Their father was born in Montreal of parents who came from the province of L'Aquila in the region of Abruzzo. VDG's mother was born in Molise, Campobasso, and immigrated with her parents to Montreal. A non-binary multimedia artist and writer, VDG's work focuses on transnationalism, historical revisionism, and the personal, and the inconsistencies of memory. They have degrees in photography and film production from Concordia University. They are a founding member of Canadian Italians Against Oppression, CHOW. VDG's work deals with Italian heritage, immigrant settings, and a search for identity, bringing together the present and the past through memory and physical spaces. In their personal essay, Repentance, published in the anthology Here and Now, VDG explores 3 different settings: their grandparents' Saint-Michel home in Montreal, the hometown in Molise, Italy, and the Twin Towers in New York City. The author reflects on the destruction that has taken place in each location and how it has affected them as an individual. And I quote, "The Italy, the year of the earthquake, 2002. It was the same year Nonna and Nonno Saint-Michel home flooded. Nonna woke up to discover many of the relics they'd brought with them from Italy were destroyed. The earthquake and the flood and the towers. These moments were so earth-shattering, so distinct, and with each of them, the gap between the person I was before and after widened," end quote. VDG's creative work juxtaposes their Italian Mediterranean heritage and Canadian nationality and illustrates the struggle of living in between both realities. "I exist between both," VDG confirms. Next slide, please. Anthony Portolese was born in 1993 and raised in the East End of Montreal. His parents were both born in Montreal and raised in Italian immigrant homes. His grandparents came from the regions of Campania and Calabria. Anthony Portolese currently works in human rights law, but also has degrees in art history and pharmacology. His literary work has been featured on the Short Story Show podcast. He published an article about his great aunt and her role in Quebec activism titled "How Those Uneducated Italians Secured Education Rights for Canadians." Portolese's writing appears in Rogers Art Review, and an excerpt of his forthcoming first novel, set in Montreal and titled "Two Cousins in a Cafe," appears in the anthology Here and Now. In his nonfiction text titled "Another Timeless Italian Tradition," Portolese describes his discomfort at family gatherings when he is pressured to bring home a girlfriend. His grandmother suspects that her grandson is gay and encourages him to confide in her. This is evident when she says how much she loves the orderly, Pierre, who had nursed her husband in his final months. And I quote, "You know," she interjected, "Pierre, he likes boys. I realize liking boys, I think it's okay. It's how Pierre was born, yeah? And I still love him, just like a grandson. I do." Unlike DiRaddo's main character in The Geography of Pluto, who tells his mother he is gay when he worries she may die in the hospital, Portolese is unable to come out to his grandmother on her deathbed. Next slide, please. Julia Gerbasi was born in 1994 and grew up in Saint-Léonard. Her parents were both born in Montreal. Her grandparents emigrated from Calabria and Campania. Gerbasi is the author of Unsent Letters, published in 2021. The letters are to family and other loved ones, as well as to the author herself. The key themes of her life are breaking and holding the traditions of my Italian-Canadian family. Gerbasi's writing deals with anxiety and gender role expectations. Unsent Letters represents, quote, "myself and my truth," says the author. So LGBTQ community as well as mental health. Gerbasi includes an image of a handwritten poem on her site. And I quote, "I don't want to be idealized. I want to be seen, heard, accepted, forgiven, understood, known for the light and who I am beneath, all the broken and distorted pieces of me." Next slide, please. Queerness, Italian heritage, and ongoing challenges. The writers discussed here belong to different generations of the Italo-Québécois community. Although the genres and approaches to writing may differ, their works deal with elements of their queerness and the influence of Italian heritage. And I quote Beneventi, "Growing up as an LGBTQ person, very often you feel that you have to keep yourself hidden in some way, especially if you're growing up at a certain historical period where there's the whole question of the closet, of the secret of the closet. And it's in the speech act of coming out of the closet that you, in a sense, reclaim your own sense of identity, especially when we're talking about the Italian-Canadian community. Very often, one cannot talk about their actual identity, their real identity. And so it remains the open secret in the family, end quote. Their writing, like their lived reality, is informed by the immigrant experience of their parents and or grandparents. In the documentary Creative Spaces, for instance, DiRaddo recounts being told, boys don't hug. Queerness and ethnicity visibly intersect in the writing of Galluccio and Portulese. Liana Cusmano's spoken word performance, Boyfriend, is especially poignant in bringing these themes together. Quote, when I tell my grandmother that I have something important to tell her, she asks me if I'm pregnant. When I tell her about men and women and all the love I have to give, she says she would have preferred it if I were pregnant, end quote. The Italian immigrant community is recognized for its contribution to business and professions that are considered stable: lawyer, accountant, doctor, educator, business person. Italian immigrants came to Quebec to make money and elevate their social status. The decision to become a writer or filmmaker, for instance, is not what is traditionally expected or hoped for by immigrant parents or grandparents. In the personal essay, You're Never Gonna Make It, Galluccio mentions that his career path was not well received by extended family and Italian-Canadian friends. The very act of pursuing writing as a profession, not to mention writing by openly queer individuals, causes disruption to conservative social structures, family, and community expectations. Queer individuals do not meet the traditional life trajectory, thus causing internal and external conflict. And that makes for great writing, says Beneventi. However, how do queer writers discussed in this paper relate to their families and the Italian community in Quebec? Are they included, seen, heard? We find some of the answers in the characters they've created in poetry and nonfiction texts, in interviews, as well as in literary events. Galluccio and DiRaddo, given their life experience and literary accomplishments, portray the queer Italo-Québécois character as confident. In DiRaddo's The Geography of Pluto, Will's mother loves him unconditionally. Galluccio's Antonio in Mambo Italiano stands up to his parents. In another timeless tradition, however, Portulese describes in detail the discomfort he feels at every family meal because he is different. VDG alludes to not being accepted as a queer person. This is especially so in The Year Without a Summer. Quote, the fog settled into all our secret places till there was nowhere left for people like us. And Cusmano explains that they have gone to family events in a binder and tie. My grandfather was really excited that I wore his tie, but other people were less excited. In Mambo Italiano, through Antonio's conversation with his mother, Galluccio describes what it was like to be an Italo-Québécois gay man in the 1990s. And I quote, waking up every morning, hoping that I would get through the day without being humiliated. I spent the formative years of my life feeling like a piece of shit, ma, feeling ashamed. You know what they do to fags in Italian high schools, ma? They kill them. Not physically, but mentally, they destroy them by chipping away at their dignity day after day after day, till you don't care anymore, till you're so numb that all you want to do is disappear, end quote. That was decades ago. How much has really changed today? Cusmano indicates that there is still prejudice. Quote, if you're a good person, nothing bad will happen to you. And that's just not true. If you work hard and you sacrifice, everything will fall into place. If you're queer, oh, you just have to graduate from high school and then nobody will bully you anymore. I think that's cruel, end quote. DiRaddo is hopeful. Given enough time, you will find your tribe. In the meantime, the act of writing can be a substitute for that family or community. In The Safest Place, Cusmano writes, as a queer person, the safest that I have felt was while writing, because there is nobody, there is no one and nothing that will judge me or threaten my safety just for writing about it. Exploring and expressing my feelings privately eventually gave me the courage to share them publicly on a stage and to an audience, end quote. Some of the writers discussed are known in literary circles, even internationally, or they are making important contributions to Canada's literary scene. They have certainly piqued the interest of academics and researchers. Next slide, please. And we need to do more projects that bring attention to silenced individuals, writers, artists, and others. Beyond academia, this paper is of social value. It challenges the reticence often present in Italian immigrant communities with respect to sexual and gender diversity. It highlights the artistic importance of these intersecting identities, and it encourages conversations about inclusion. Because very little has been published on queer English language writers in Quebec, I hope that this paper will serve as a stepping stone for future work on queer Italo-Québécois writing. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Licia. So we'll move on to Q&A, question and answer section of our event. So if you would like to ask a question, just put your question into the chat box and we'll move on from there. So I have a question from Lorraine. Thanks for your presentation. For the writers you describe, are there implications for writing in English as opposed to Italian or French? Do you think they see themselves as part of the English-speaking communities, or if this is of relevance in their work?
Well, the writers that I talked about are English language writers in Quebec. They all went to English language schools. English is the language that they feel most comfortable with. Some of them are also completely comfortable in French, but not all of them. And some of them speak Italian fluently, others not. They may speak a dialect, but definitely English is the language that they grew up with, that they feel the most comfortable with, and that they can express themselves the best in. And so they are all active in English language communities in Quebec. You know, the Italian community they're connected through family and friends, but I don't think any of them. I mean, if they've written in Italian or French, it has been in translation. That is, they've presented their work in translation, especially in French or in Italian, but they didn't write originally in those languages.
Well, I have a follow-up question,
Yes.
Licia. They write mostly in English. Can you talk a little bit about when there are little bits of Italian in the text?
Mm-hmm.
What does that represent for the sense of identity, the sense of Italian identity, or as a contradistinction to their sense of a queer identity, for instance?
They're in these writers. I mean, there are words here and there like paisa or you know, I think in something that I heard on Zoom recently, there were references to l'amica geniale. But that is a connection to their roots. It is what Mary Di Michele and Francesco Lorigo used to call the device of the stone, which forces you to interrupt the reading, to read the heritage language word, and perhaps if you're a reader who doesn't read Italian, go look it up. So I think the presence of, say, words in Italian would cause the reader to be more active in the text. That's the way that I would read. But that I haven't, in these writers, I haven't seen that much Italian language in their works. Say, compared to the writers that I studied, the older writers, my generation of writers. Other questions?
Yeah, the follow-up. Do you think writing in English adds a layer of minorization? I think that's Lorraine, I believe. Yeah.
A layer of minorization.
Minorization, a kind of a minority aspect to the text.
Well, English language writers in Quebec are a minority within a minority, French language of Quebec, right? Another minority in Canada. But I think that the English language writers in Quebec are quite strong. The community is quite an active, quite a strong community. I don't think that they would, these writers would see themselves as part of a minority necessarily as writers, because they are working within, although a minority, the English language writers, it is a minority, but I myself as an English language writer, I don't feel like a minority in Quebec. I feel surrounded, well surrounded by other English language writers.
Other questions? I guess I have a question. So you
Yes.
started the talk with Monica Meneghetti's kind of negative experience of her reading, of having to hide in some extent the queer aspects of her writing and so on. So with all the work you've done in the last few years around this corpus, have you experienced any kind of negative reaction, especially in terms of the Italian community, in terms of critics of Italian Canadian writing? What has been the reception, I guess?
With this project, like okay, well, with every, I wasn't, so I'm not a member of the queer community, I'm an ally. So it was news to me when we first did a first presentation on the topic that I had to prepare for any form of, say, negativity or violence, on Zoom. Let's say when we first screened the creative spaces, it had never occurred to me that I needed to prepare. And with every Zoom, yeah, there was that preparation in case somebody comes either to say, who are you to do this project? You're not a member of the queer community. Or who are you, Italian doing this, Italian Canadian. And there has never been any quote unquote violence in the Zooms, but in one of the recent events, I did get an email. Well, it went to the department, and some older professor who complained about, this is not Italian studies. So that was the only, like, the closest to anything negative. I think people in my circles wonder why I'm doing this project, and I can answer that question if you're interested. Why did I start the project? Because, well, as you know, I'm an independent researcher. So that means I'm not, don't have the backing of an institution. I'm doing this on my own. And I've always sought to do research where there was something missing. So before this queer project, I was working on women, Italian Canadian women writers, because from having done a PhD thesis in Italian Canadian writing, I myself studied, there were 5 writers, 3 of them were men, 2 of them were women, right? And then the 10 years after that, 15 years after that, I almost solely dedicated my research and my academic writing to women. And then when I looked around to see what wasn't being done in the Italian Canadian scholarly community, literary community, it was the queer Italian Canadian writers. And so that's why, and it was clearly, Dominic and I had been talking about it for a while, but I think it was really when Monica Meneghetti came with this beautiful memoir. It is really a beautiful memoir if you haven't read it. And I had read it, and I was in the audience when she came to Montreal, and I was surprised that she read only about food. And I sent her an email and asked her, and she says she looked at the audience. And as a writer, I do that too. I prepare 1 or 2 stories, and when I get to the venue, an Italian Canadian audience, and you look, oh, there's some older people, maybe I won't read this story. We as writers sometimes are influenced by the visual audience. And yeah, so that's why this project and I waited. I must say, maybe I'm not the best placed person to do this kind of work for a number of reasons, but I waited for somebody else to do it. I'm still waiting, except for the people who got involved with the project. So I hope, as I said at the end there, I hope that this is a stepping stone for other people. And I am doing so. The Here and Now book, the anthology, has 38 contributors. Granted, I must say some of them did not use their real name. They're not ready to be recognized. You know, if ever family were to read this book, probably not. Another thing that I often hear is Italian Canadians don't read, so don't worry. Like, they won't pick up your book. I'm like, okay. But I am also working on a second volume, because with the first volume, we were inclusive. We tried until it went to the printers. If somebody sent me a text before the book had gone to the printers, I did fit it in. And then a few more writers came to me after it had gone to the printers, because it does take time for word to get out, but also it takes time for people to be ready. And I think now, having done a film, having done a first book, there is a call out there for a second volume. There are a lot of new names who have come to us, not necessarily Italo-Québécois, mostly Italian Canadians. Still, some of them who are not ready to use their names, and that's okay. But I'm hoping that this project, you know, eventually somebody younger will continue this work, and eventually those people who are in the first volume and or the second volume not using their first names will feel comfortable using their names in later projects.
Thank you, Licia. There's a few other questions.
Yes.
How can we bridge the gap of this community into the education system from your point of view?
The gap of this community, the gap in can you...
I assume, how do you get this material into the education system? How does this
Yes.
material
Okay.
get included in courses and so on?
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot of interest in universities and CEGEPs for this project. High school, it really would mean it would have to be a specific teacher who's interested and who would present it to the classroom. From having been a high school teacher in adult education, I remember that there were specific books that we had to teach. Every once in a while, I try to sneak in something Italian Canadian. But if you have an obligation to teach these books, and you can't not teach them, right, because of exams and all of that, you'd have to add another element. So I'm not sure how realistic that is. I know that there are a number of teachers who are including artists, writers as guests. That might be a way to get it into the education system, say high school, even CEGEP. But beyond that, I think it'll take a really long time, because Italian Canadian writers are not often included in the education system. So here we are, it's even more of a sub corpus, right? Queer Italian Canadian or queer Italo-Québécois. It's going to take a long time. I'm really interested in how also the Italian Canadian community can help to embrace their own writers first, and queer Italo-Québécois writers. I was really, one of the things that really struck me is one of the contributors in the anthology Here and Now, Amber Dawn. I had heard her several times reading on the CBC or being interviewed, and I had no clue until someone told me that that person was of Italian heritage. So I'm guessing there is a lot of pain, as I read also from the authors that I'm presenting today. There is hope, but there is a lot of pain. There's still, even with the younger, we're talking about the writers, Julia, Liana, V, Anthony, they're in their 20s, late 20s. I would have hoped that they would have had more of a reception, more of a welcoming from the community, from their friends. I mean, we look at the high school. I'm in Saint Leonard. I'm looking at the schools that my kids went to. I think that you know, not very many students who were queer would go around saying, "Hey, I'm queer." You know, they're and that comes probably from, you know, the first generation, my generation. It's some of the mentalities are passed on, and some of it I think is really fear of the unknown, right? Because, well, if you don't know anyone who's gay and you only know what you think you've heard about being gay. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, of my parents. They had no experience with the queer community. It was only what they saw on the news, for instance, the Pride Parade. That was their only connection until one of their grandchildren came out to them. And that's like you know, that takes some time to get used to it, some time to learn. In Liana's case, it's pronouns. I mean, that takes a long time to, if you've always considered your grandchild to be a girl, now all of a sudden the grandchild tells you, I don't identify as a girl. Like, I'm thinking for the grandparents, that's like a lot of wheels turning there, right? So it does take some time. I've gone off on a tangent.
Okay. Another question. Do connections exist between the queer authors or artists in the Quebecois, Italian, Canadian context versus queer authors in Italy? How does nationhood change queer expressions of writing or literature?
Well, I'm really not familiar with queer writers in Italy. I've heard both. If you listen to Steve Galluccio in the documentary, by the way, the documentary is available on YouTube. You can watch it. If you go to AICW Canada, that's the YouTube channel. It's there, 28 minutes. It's available to watch all of it. Steve in that documentary says that Italy is really advanced. The first gay couple that he ever saw holding hands was in a small town in Italy. If you talk to other people, they will say that yes, Italy is perhaps advanced in intellectual or academic circles, but then Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde is not that advanced. Maybe that's a little bit as it is here. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think that the Italians who came to Quebec have stayed with that mentality, whatever they knew about the LGBTQ plus community there. I mean, they didn't know anything there, but it stayed with, you know, that sort of closed way of thinking. I'm thinking of my own relatives in Italy. Some of them are open and some of them are not. So it really depends on where they are, in an urban center, in a less urban center, their age.
If I can jump in, I would disagree.
Yes, go ahead.
I would disagree with Steve Galluccio in terms of queer studies in Italy. The very first queer studies conference happened just a few years ago in Italy, and I was there. And even in terms of, you know, acceptance and so on, I think there's a lot of work to be done in Italy. So I have another question here. Do you see specific distinctions between Italo-Québécois literature and other queer Italian-Canadian literature? Is there a particular reason for focusing on Québécois writers?
Okay, so why am I focusing on Québécois writers? That is because QUESCREN, you know, is doing projects with English language projects in Quebec. So for the purposes of this paper, I'm focusing on the English language, and actually they're all Montreal writers. So that's why I've chosen these writers. These are the ones that I know in Quebec. There are others that are coming that I'm aware of now with the second anthology I'm working on. But the wider project, the Queer and Italian Canadian project, that's a national project. So it's just for the purposes of this talk and the paper that I did for QUESCREN that I focused on the 6 writers that I talked about. But the project is Canada.
Okay.
Did I answer that question? I think there was another part to the question.
Is there a particular reason for focusing on Quebecois? No, that's you answered it. There's a series of questions / suggestions.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be more interesting to speak of this topic across Canada, not limited to Quebec? How does this concern affect forms of expression? Is it important that this generational expression help older generations to come out?
I mean, I'm thinking of my generation and the people I know who are queer. They're never going to come out. It's just, you know, they're 60. I'm 60. So if you haven't said anything until now, you might when your parents die or grandparents, or, you know what I mean? So would the younger people, well, there's something really interesting in the projects, the 3 projects that I mentioned, and that's where that last slide had the 3 projects: the Queer Italian-Canadian project, which is the creative spaces, the documentary, the anthology, the series. If you go to the website, you'll see all the work we've done, media interviews. There's all the bios of all the people who are in the first volume. Then I'm co-director of the Queer Italian-Canadian Artist Project at the University of Toronto's Frank Iacobucci Center. And then there's a 3rd project, and I'm hoping there'll be more projects. Maybe there are projects I'm not aware of. There is an intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and cross-gender identity project with Vincenzo Pietropalo, who's an older established documentary photographer. He's in his 70s, and Liana Cusmano in their 20s. So a non-queer and a queer artists, different disciplines coming together to do poetry and photography of queer spaces in Montreal and Quebec. So that'll be an exhibit and eventually a book. And I think that might help. And I think that is why they've come together, because here you have an established older man, respected in the community across Canada, and a younger person, emerging artist. So if you put those voices together, they might not, you know, come to see Liana's performance of the poems that come out of this exhibit, but they will come to see Vince's photos, right? And vice versa. The younger queer Italian Canadians might not go see an older man's photos, but they might come to hear Liana's poetry. So I think more of that would help. So I've had conversations with my parents and my in-laws where I explained to them what this project is. I never thought I would do that. And they were receptive. Like, again, I could see the wheels turning, always asking me questions. But they're asking questions. I didn't get, but I must say, when Liana came out to their grandparents, Liana did it on their own, in their own time when they were ready. Following that conversation, I spoke to the grandparents. Said, did you understand what Liana said? Yes. All right. Just so it's clear, if there is a choice to be made between my child and anybody else, it's a no-brainer. My child comes first. That says a lot, I think. The support of close people, right? And the grandparents, I mean, not, as Dominic has written, not everyone is ready to do that, mostly because it's a lot, like DiRaddo says in the documentary. It's such a big disconnect from what they've lived, and all of a sudden you're telling me this, what I might have seen on Tout le monde en parle, and now it's in my family. Like, they need time, I think. But then Steve Gallucci will say, no chances. Don't tell me he's 80, 90, and he's never going to understand. No chances. And I agree with him, Because if we're going to make allowances for an old person or somebody else who's not educated, then like, what about the people who are suffering? And the young people who are artists are expressing this through their art, whether it's writing, painting, film. What about the young people in high school or even elementary school who have no way to express this? And like Steve, the words that Antonio says to his mother, high school, they kill you in high school if you say in gym class that you're gay. They don't literally stab you, but they will ostracize you.
Right. Well, we're coming up on 1 o'clock, so I'll close the Q&A and pass the word on to Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Licia. Thank you, Dominique. And thank you all for attending today's event. We always want to hear your feedback, and we invite you to fill out the evaluation form for today's Lunch and Learn. You'll find the link in the chat, and I'll put it in after. Stay tuned for upcoming events in our Lunch and Learn series. We're going to have a bunch in the next few months. And the best way to learn about what's coming up in our programming is to sign up for a newsletter if you haven't already, but you should start seeing new things on our events page within a week or two. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, and to repeat that Quebec also receives funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University. Thank you again for being here, and we wish you all a great day.